Entrepreneurship
on 702.
My guest is Andisa Ramavhunga. He's a chief group advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group. We're talking about funding for businesses. Andisa, thank you so much for coming through. I really appreciate your time. We started off by talking about the issue of funding in our last conversation. I do want us, for the benefit of those that would not have been part of the conversation, to go back to a very salient point, I think, and that is to say that there is funding options for businesses at different stages of their development or evolution. Let's go back to that.
Thank you, Aubrey. So it's quite important to understand that theory, because what that theory dictates is that a business, as it grows, has different needs for funding. And it's quite important as well to say that as the business grow, the risk that the business itself is, the operational risk, or the risk, basically what I mean by that is its survival chances obviously grow as the business grows, right? So naturally that business will attract different types of funders based on the age that it's at, based on the risk that it itself possesses, right, inherently due to its age, and naturally the type of funders that are willing to get involved in funding that business. So that theory is quite important before I get to it. But before I pronounce on the theory as well, Aubrey, it's quite important to realize that also with funding, it's a problem that entrepreneurs must navigate and solve. And the reason why I say that particularly, funding, particularly in the South African context, has been reduced to debt funding. Why can't lenders lend us the money, right? But there are various ways of funding the business. If you remember when we had the conversation around the financial statements, we said it's either you get debt funding or you get equity funding, which is skin in the game. So again, it's to impress on entrepreneurs to say that debt lenders are not necessarily the only people that you need to chase after in getting finance, but you can find people with interest in your business because it either complements or fits into their growth plans, and those people by themselves can invest in that business, by the way, and provide the necessary funding. And I don't want entrepreneurs to box themselves, because there's also, again, value creation in structuring a deal. This is where I would say entrepreneurs must talk to a deal, because nothing says you can't talk to an equity funder and raise debt. And that's quite important. And what do I mean by that? You can come, for example, to another businessman who has a like-minded value proposition to yours, and you can talk to them both equity and debt, is to say, okay, maybe if you are not willing to just advance equity money by itself, you can help me raise the debt as well. So again, there's deals to be made in there. But coming back to the stages, we sort of like pronounced on 4 stages, and I did say that the theory, depending on who you talk to, but I think it differs. But for simplicity, I think there are 4 stages that a business goes through. There's what we call founding phase or startup phase, where if you think about those businesses, they don't have a proven track record. And what does that mean? It means that they are also trying to almost pilot or find out whether their value proposition is palatable or likable to the market, and whether there is a market that is willing to pay for those products. Inherently, the risk is high there, because you are still trying to make a sale, but you have not really made enough sales, or even made one sale. So that's the startup phase. And the requirements there are not so much big growth requirements. It's really seed type requirements. It's really about getting started, buying your initial stock, going to your initial customers and be able to deliver your value proposition. So again, the amounts of monies that are required are typically not that large compared to the other stages of the business. And obviously I say this because it's relative. It's really about getting off the blocks. You have an idea now. You sort of know where to plant that idea and who to sell to. You just need money that will get you started to initially buy that microwave or buy that van buy the truck or buy the initial stock and be able to deliver to your customers. The second phase, and I'll come back again to say what type of funders are likely to fund which type of stage of growth. The second phase is the growth phase, or where I call this scaling phase. This is where the business is somewhat has established now. It has gotten off the blocks. You typically have customers that are buying from you, and there you are dealing with probably cash flow issues. How do you service those customers? But quite importantly as well, you're thinking about growth as well, moving to other markets and funding that growth. And most of the challenges there are less about profitability, although you'd find those teething issues when it comes to profitability. But the biggest risk to the business there is not so much whether the business is viable or not, but it's around the cash flow, whether you have enough money to start servicing and you don't run out of cash to start servicing your. So I call that this growth phase and the scaling phase.
Right.
And there are a number of issues there. You'll find that typically you're starting to hire more people. You're starting to move into other jurisdiction or other geographies. You're starting to systematize your business. You're now starting to invest in things like an ERP system or a sales system of some sort. You're needing money to start paying administrative type expenses around offices and head offices and other offices and so forth. And I call that the exciting times of the business is the growth phase of the business. The third one is when the business is matured. Now this is a business that runs from itself. It's probably profitable enough. You find that it's starting to pile up cash as well. It's starting to think more broadly around strategies, around how to compete aggressively, how to win the market share,
how to consolidate its position. Yeah.
Starting to think about acquisitions. Where must I be acquiring another business, obviously based on strategy, and big type expansion. But it's a largely stable business. It's got consistent cash flow. It's got a good enough profitability. It's hardly running out of cash, and hence we call it a mature business. And then the final stage, which is the fourth one, is the decline, where now you have the cash, but probably the profitability starts being constrained. You start eating into your balance sheet, your cash portion to fund the business. The growth is not as much as when you were in a mature or earlier or the other earlier types of phases. And you're finding now that you're having to maybe let go of certain people or let go of certain jurisdiction, streamlining your product line because some products are profitable or not. But it's really the decline phase, which by the way means your business needs to start turning around, or maybe you start selling it to other people. But anyway, you can exit in any stage, I would say, from the scaling phase, which is the growth phase, to the mature phase, and even to a certain extent to the decline. You can start exiting your business. Now, all of these, you realize that it could be the same business, by the way, at a different point in time.
Sure.
It has different challenges. A scaling business has different challenges to a startup business, because here is really about growth. Here is really about getting off the blocks. So typically what you find in the startup phase is that no one typically would want to fund that business. And hence you hear of this triple F word that I spoke about, which is friends, fools, and family. So these are people, in fact, fools. There's a technical term for it called angel investors. People who've got lots of cash, very high appetite for risk. They'll probably have a relationship to you or not, and they're doing the transaction or investing in you because they are.
It's usually people that'll see your passion.
They'll see your passion, and they'll know you as a child. They're betting on you more than
the jockey,
really the business, right? And friends and family as well. But there's quite a lot of skin in the game that entrepreneurs do as well. If you've just quit your job and you've cashed out your pension fund, or you still have some credit line in terms of personal credit cards, by the way, that you use to pump into the business, those would typically be the sources of funds, by the way, that you typically are able to access at that early on stage. So, and I say this because you'll find that a lot of people would say, I'm in a startup phase and I want to go to the bank, and banks don't lend us money.
Sure.
Because the risk appetite inherent in the business is just so high. Banks by nature are looking for consistent cash flow. They are looking for a good track record, and they are looking more often than not. And again,
collateral.
collateral,
Yeah.
right? They'll say, okay, can we secure some of your assets too? And not that banks won't fund. That you'll find that you are actually raising, particularly if you've been in a job. For example, you have a home loan and you are able to get a revolving facility out of your home loan.
Right.
So the bank is not actually funding your business, but it's funding you for a home loan. But
it's funding your its asset, which is the home.
Yeah.
And you benefiting out of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, if you were to come to them, because that's a different profile type of risk. And hence that's why I'm saying you're actually using your own leverage as a person,
right,
to fund your own business, but the banks
and not the business,
business leverage, yeah. And yeah, so banks will naturally not look at that type of a business for those obvious reasons that says you have not proven yourself, you don't have a consistent record of showing cash flow. It means you are still figuring this thing out for yourself, and banks. Naturally, because it's also not their money. Remember, banks also own land. They're using, banks, by the way, are a business as well. They're not a charity.
Sure.
They get money from general populace.
Yeah.
They need to pay that back. They're heavily regulated to pay that back.
Yeah.
And the way that they would go land it is they'll follow prudent risk management practices. And it's basically to almost bet on sure bets and things that would de-risk it by allowing them to access other collateral or covenants for those bankers who understand the language. That in the event that we're not able to pay, they're able to take your car, for example, and sell it,
right,
or your home and sell it and be able to recover the money. So those are the type of funding possible.
I want to invite you to be part of this conversation. My guest is Chief Group Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting. His name is Andisa Ramavhunga, and we are talking about funding for businesses. You probably have been listening and you've been thinking, yeah, my business is at the startup phase or at the growth phase or at the mature phase. We haven't talked about the decline phase yet. We want to talk a little bit about that. But I'm interested to find out where your business is at. Are you aware of where your business is at in terms of the evolution of businesses, of the various phases of a business? I'm interested to hear from you, but I am also interested to find out whether you are aware of the types of funding that exist. So one type of funding is where you can get somebody to take up some equity in your business, right? So in other words, where they actually fund the business from the point of view that they're not giving you debt.
Yeah.
They are becoming part of the business.
Yes.
They're becoming shareholders of the business.
Yes.
Or you can perhaps get the kind of funding where you owe the lender or the person that is funding you money. In the equity space, you don't owe them anything because they are now part of the business. Am I correct?
No, absolutely.
Yeah?
So the price of that obviously is the piece of your business.
Yes.
Meaning that they are part of the risk of the business.
Yes.
And you'll find that
they're taking on the risk.
Yeah.
Okay.
And particularly if they're investing more money than you are, they'll typically make that decision, one, because the cost to them is probably not that high. And obviously the upside to them would probably be much, much higher than the money that they put in.
Right.
So you'll typically find that they'll come in and say, hey, you have this idea, I like it. And they'll put in arbitrary figures to say, okay, I'll take 50% of your business. Because what that means is that they actually are going to be taking 50% of the future profits.
Yeah. Ultimately.
Ultimately. Yeah. That's why it's a more expensive type of so where you are paying or you are foregoing 50% of your future profits to a partner because they become part and parcel of your business. That said, I do need to draw attention to entrepreneurs to say that government has made instruments available for grant funding, by the way, in the early phase of the business. And these are very quite important that entrepreneurs get involved in. I mean, there are institutions like, for example, the NYDA that would obviously only finance up to 35 years. I think that's because their target is youth and they've got priority sectors in there.
Right.
There's the likes of CEDA, I think SEDA can make up to 5 million available in grant. I stand corrected, by the way. And at some point we will get the guys who look after this organization to come and pack the products that they have. But what that makes available, for example, the likes of SEDA, and there's quite a number of these other type institutions like these ones, is that they'll invest in your marketing, for example. They'll invest in equipment, obviously not exceeding that 5 million. They also provide training and mentoring to entrepreneurs. So in a way, you can use that money, to access market, to buy the minimal equipment that you need to turn obviously raw material into product. So printing facilities, for example, and I think even some manufacturing equipment, they'll fund you. I think it's up to the cap of about 5 million. So there are those instruments that are available, and hence that's why I raised the thing, the argument that says funding as well should be treated like strategy. By the way, it's a problem-solving exercise, and you need to think carefully about your business around where can I de-risk my business by accessing those pockets of funding that are grant, and when do I then go to angel investors, people who are willing to then take a portion of my business and those ones are typically more expensive. Remember, a grant, you don't have to pay it back.
Yes.
And you don't necessarily introduce a shareholder at all in your business. So it becomes the more.
What is the thinking behind the grant? I mean, why would government make taxpayer money available? And I imagine, as you said, that these are agencies that have been created by government, the NYDA, SEDA, and so forth.
Yeah.
What is the fundamental philosophy behind the grant? This is taxpayer money, and it is effectively being given to an entrepreneur. What's the thinking behind that?
So my hypothesis for that is, and we've had this conversation, you and I, at some point, that South Africa does not have a vibrant venture capitalist industry, right? Because naturally, it's startups. I would even argue startups and early scaling businesses are a forte of venture capitalists, but obviously for high growth type businesses. So the whole aim is to de-risk and try encourage as many entrepreneurs as possible, and particularly given our challenges in the country of high unemployment. So it makes sense that government will make available those instruments. But I mean, these are not big amounts. Again, they're very small in nature. As I've mentioned, I think not SEFA, but SEDA was the largest one I've seen, I think, with 5 million. SEFA does also offer some certain grants, but now we are talking small businesses that are not necessarily startups. But they must have quite a sizable, they still could be small business. And this is the interesting thing, by the way, that we need to keep in mind. Small business does not necessarily mean startup. There's a criteria around what your turnover is and what your number of employees.
That's very important.
You employ. So I don't also want us to mix startup and small business. Some other business remain small for a very long time and grow in profit. In fact, they become even a matured business, still being small. So the reason why I ventured the theory was to more highlight the challenges that typical entrepreneurs will face in the life cycle, and not so much define what their sizes are. But it's natural that you will not find a large organization that is a startup.
Sure.
Unless it's a spin-off of another bigger organization.
I want to invite our listeners into the conversation and hear your thoughts about what you've already come to understand on 011-883-0702 as I speak to Andisa Ramavhunga, chief group advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting. We're talking about funding for various for businesses at various stages of growth. We've heard grant, we've heard equity funding, we've heard of lending funding, and clearly it is a problem-solving mechanism, and therefore it must be understood as part of your strategic involvement in a business. And indeed, you need to really be clear about which type of funding is right for your organization.
And be aware of the implications.
Absolutely. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about the issue of risk. And how how funders interpret risk. How do they understand whether I am a good risk or a bad risk?
Yeah.
And how do I communicate that as an entrepreneur? I mean, what we're doing is a very high level conversation about how to think about how to unlock funding as a business. But I'm also interested to hear from you. What are funders looking for, and what are they looking at? Yeah. So because I think they are businesses too, right?
Yeah.
They want to fund businesses that they are going to get a return on investment on too.
Yeah.
Especially those that are perhaps equity funders or lenders, right? Yeah. Maybe not so much those that are grant givers, right?
Yeah.
But even then, what are they looking at? I mean, I can't just rock up tomorrow and just say, listen, give me money, I'm a startup, or give me money, I've got to speak the language that unlocks the funding. Yeah. So give us a call, 011-883-0702. And I'm really hoping that you can be part of this conversation. I think it's a pivotal conversation. I think it's the most important conversation for our economy. I really, really believe that to be the case. Yeah. Vusi Tembagwayo is calling in. Bravusi, so good to hear from you, man.
How you be?
I'm well, man. I'm very, very well. Glad to hear that you're listening. Your thoughts?
Indeed.
Yep.
Indeed. I'm listening online from out the country, but I wanted to add this comment, which I think is important for yourself and your guest, in agreement in part with some of the things your guest is saying. So the venture capital market ecosystem in South Africa is miles and away from what it was 10 years ago. There's been a lot of development.
Yeah.
Much of the capital is actually now based in the Western Cape. So I would recommend anybody listening to this to have a look at the SALCA reports, because they talk about where the capital is domiciled. But the narrower issue I wanted to talk to maybe just a little bit with your guest on is the role the state needs to play. And I think it's something South Africa really has to be honest with itself about.
Yeah.
There has never been a time in economic history where there has been a development of any capital markets, including venture capital, without the state leading it. So the idea that there's going to be private players in venture capital who get ahead of the state is just not going to happen. The world's largest venture capital market is the United States. And they effectively built that venture capital market ecosystem by allowing for tax incentives for individuals to invest, high net worth individuals to invest in early stage businesses. We had that in South Africa because we had the Section 12J. Now, admittedly, it was abused by some players in the industry, but rather than the government regulate around the abuse, they scrapped it. And you've seen a lot of what would be high net worth individuals, family offices, private capital sitting in lots of families and trusts that was invested in this ecosystem pull back because that incentive is no longer there. So I'm saying all of that to make the simple point that, CIFA, CEDA, IDC, and several others will play the role they play in the stratification of the capital market system. But for early stage businesses where the risk is high, it's based on the operator and the capital is not available, the only way that it's going to be built more intentionally is if the South African government gets involved. If it doesn't, then the situation as it is will persist. You and I have had this conversation ad nausea, and this conversation will take place in 10 years' time unless the state is intentional about saying we're going to incentivize high net worth individuals to invest their money in early stage businesses that are scaling for growth. That's the only way it's going to happen.
I imagine government would argue that we already have these agencies, NYDA, CEDA, CIFA, and that is, and many times we are offering grants to businesses, not equity demands, not lending demands. We're doing our part. If we do what Vusi is saying, we're just making the rich richer. I would imagine that might be the retort. How would you respond?
You are making the rich richer, but that's how capitalism works. Capitalism works when you allow individuals who have capital to invest it for a capital return. So we can have a debate around socialism and capitalism and how those need to work in the broader economic system of South Africa. But if you want to build a venture, it's in the name, venture capital, right? If you want to build a venture capital market system, then you're going to need individuals, families. There's tons of money. I wish people understood how much money is sitting with second, third, fourth generation families, entrepreneurs. We work with them daily. hundreds of billions of rands that could be deployed into the economy that's not being deployed because the economic incentive isn't there. I just want to make one very quick point, Aubrey, just in summary for you on this. You spoke about the national agencies. South Africans don't even know that provinces have their own agencies. So the Free State has the Free State Development Corporation, Gauteng has the Gauteng Enterprise Propeller, Limpopo has the Limpopo Economic Development Agency, Mpumalanga, the Mpumalanga Economic Growth Agency. Even the provinces have their own agencies. But this is what we've done in South Africa for the past 30 years. We threw big government at problems that we should be throwing private incentive at. So I'm not arguing for private incentive versus government. I'm saying you can build those in tandem. But let's be clear, there is never a time in history when any government agency is going to beat any private capital player in deploying capital, because it's in the nature of private capital to deploy capital. It's the nature of the game. So I would say it's about building a system that works together. I thought they had a fantastic innings with the Section 12J. And for the policymakers listening to this conversation, I think the only thing to say is revisit that, right? Look at what's happening in Mauritius right now as we speak. What's happening in Rwanda? What's happening in the UAE? What's happening in the Asian Southeast Asian countries? I've just come from there. Those are all economies that have understood if you created tax incentives for high net worth individuals, family offices to invest capital in small businesses, they will build small businesses. Those businesses will create value. Value creates jobs. Jobs build the economy. It's a very simple economic model. And I think it's something we just need to think about in terms of building in a system that's and, not or. So it's and private capital, not government or private capital.
Andisa?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you, Vusi. Without fail, you know what I've been trying to steer away from is having that political conversation, I guess. In fact, I was the first one, Aubrey, if you remember that, to say if we were to open up the policy debate and in fact, I've mentioned some of the low-hanging fruit, I think, that government can use, not only, by the way, Vusi, from a policy and an investor-friendly environment that they can create, but how do you stimulate the state spend, which is massive, to unlock entrepreneurship? But again, that's a political debate, by the way, that I try to steer away from this conversation. You might say that we may be doing it at disservice for the entrepreneur. But right now is to say, with what we have available, what is it that we can do to build a resilient entrepreneur who's able to navigate the little that we have and make it work for their own environment? Yeah, it's not perfect, but at least it gets us going and it gets us thinking about these things and keeping us in the game.
But I think what you're saying, Vusi, and again, I think you underscore that the and not, so it's not an exclusive sort of issue that you're raising here. You're saying that we can chew and run at the same time. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just to add on to what Andis is saying, right? If you think about, a small business that's looking to scale, looking for a small sum of money, R1 million in capital. Now, when you start thinking about how do you structure that, if you have a government that's taking 20% of that, you then have a high net worth individual or family taking an additional 20% of that. What that means is between the entrepreneur and the commercial lenders, the banks, there's only 60% of the capital that now needs to be answered for. That drastically changes the cost of capital, and it also changes the risk appetite. Right now, some of the state agencies, to their credit, actually do this. If you go and talk to CIFA, I know Eskom Pension Fund, for instance, at some point looked at building their own venture capital business. But if you go and talk to them, they actually do this. They blend the financing with commercial instruments. So, Andis, I think you're absolutely on the money. And I think what's important for those of us in the ecosystem is to begin to have conversations that allow the policymakers to understand that the system really needs us to think above our political, ideological perspectives and think more around what does the market need. For a young person or even just an entrepreneur based in a township somewhere trying to, build a business that's going to be competing in the township economy. For them, when we start talking about things like capital structure and cost of capital, we lose them. They're just like, look, man, I need X amount to build this thing, and I know the business is going to make the money. Can you provide the money, yes or no? And I think it's really important for us to work together, all of the players in the ecosystem, so that we have a policy framework that works and an environment that, because even entrepreneurs need an economy that's growing. You can't grow a business in an economy that's not growing. So for the entrepreneurs listening to this, if you've grown your business at anything over 3% over the past 10 years on a compounded annual growth rate, you've grown in an economy that isn't, and that says everything.
Ravusi, thanks very much for your contribution, and this is an open invitation for you to join us at some point. I'll make sure that your people get the invitation, but we do need to take this conversation further. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you to Andisa for the conversation.
Vusi Tembegwayo, one of our entrepreneurs, luminary entrepreneurs, adding his voice to the conversation on funding. Piri is an Alex. Piri, good evening to you.
Hi, good evening, bro. Andisa there. You guys mustn't lose us again, because now you're talking big stuff there.
Did you hear these guys talking about a small amount, like $1 million rand? Like a small amount, like $1 million rand.
Like $1 million rand,
I just need 2,000 rand, man.
We just need to just get by, bro.
Yeah, I hear you, bro. I hear you.
But I mean, the conversation is very relevant and important. And I again, it needs to resonate with us, the small guys in the streets of Alex and Tembisa, so that we can be able to internalize the knowledge and try to use it to get this kind of funding to get going, bro. Sure. But what I want to understand as well, bro, I'm actually more of what I consider myself a social entrepreneur. So I have some sort of like an NGO that seeks to develop young people actually here in the township. So what we do is we have like a training campaigns. We have like a sessions where we call business people to come and motivate young people and those kind of things about climate change and cleaning the environment and those kind of things. So we are not really in the profit-making space, perhaps. We don't really look at the bottom line, but we just want to do.
It's about developmental issues, yeah.
Correct. So I mean, what I want to understand from Andisa is that that kind of business, because I'm actually just sort of like a startup as well. So I don't have the 3 Fs. I just use my small salary that I work for in my 9 to 5. I mean, that kind of a business, can it also be able to access, funds from this venture capitalists as they are referred to, perhaps, if I make sense?
Got you, Piri. You make absolute sense. But I do want to say this. I know that maybe you're a social entrepreneur and you don't have profit as a major incentive. I think at some point we do need to talk about that psychology, Piri, because I'm finding that when we have even the slightest aversion to profit making, we may be inadvertently sabotaging our businesses. Because that's what business is about. It's about creating that surplus so that you can grow, right? But that's not the question that you're raising. Andisa?
Yeah, no, Piri is absolutely right. But by the way, just because you are not making money does not mean you are not creating value. Remember, we had this conversation when we defined strategy, and I defined it as the ability to create value, and I think the profit motive of it comes to when I add the element of capturing, which means how much of that value you create do you expropriate and keep as a surplus to your business. And sometime I used the analogy of a financial statement that says the value you create is the revenues you are able to accrue in a year. How much of that value you capture is the profits, right? Because some of it is taken by your supplier. Well, quite a lot of it is taken by your consumer or whoever you are servicing, because ultimately they are the ones who pay for the entire revenue line, right? And then the next set of people who expropriate the value are the people who work for you, and then your suppliers and so forth, and what you keep in the end. I guess what we are saying is that you don't want to keep anything because you want to have as much of that value accruing to the people that we are solving problems for. the question then becomes, when you say you want funding, and again, not to say that there aren't any funding available for NGOs, but there's a different type of funding. For example, if you're in social development, for example, there are people who would look at funding. You still need to apply, by the way. There are programs that are there within social development. If you are servicing a mandate that's aligned to social development, where you can go access these pockets of money, obviously they'll come back and they will even argue that you don't need to make money off it, but you need to show how much of that dividend are you giving back to the consumer. So I guess what my analogy is saying with this, Brapiri, is that the concepts still hold. The concepts of business, they still hold. I guess what differs is, one, how much of that value you expropriate. I mean, we had a full conversation, by the way, around thinking about the viability of your services, the feasibility of them, and the profitability of them. And obviously, in your case, the profitability will be zero. But it's safe to say that the likes of CIFA, the likes of IDC, I think they will be less likely, if ever they were, to ever fund an NGO, because ultimately with those guys, they are debt lenders, and you need to bring back the money. And if you understand the concept and the theory of business, is that you pay the lenders after you've made revenue for starters, and you've paid your employers, and you've paid your suppliers. Then the next guy to be paid would be the lender, and then the last guy to be paid is the taxman. So unless you are able to make the revenue, you are not going to have the likelihood of being able to fund to access funding from traditional lenders, because they are natural debt lenders. But that said, there are other institutions, the Lotto, for example, depending on what you are doing, and they typically term that grant funding, because it's what it is. You can, by the way, fund your entire business or your entire revenue line through grants, where you're accessing different pockets of grants. But again, you still need to understand your ecosystem, find like-minded grant funders aligned to the mandate and the philosophy of who they want to create the value for, and be able to access those funds.
Piri, I'm going to let you go. So as you percolate in that, thank you very much on that question. I do want to bring it down a notch, just in terms of the terminology and that. But before I do that, let me take a quick call from Refilwe in White City, Jabavu. Good evening to you, Refilwe.
Perhaps, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, my brother. Tell me what is on your mind.
Yeah, as a young person that has been running business for past 7 years, I came to the conclusion that the Department of Small Business, along with its agencies, meaning FIDA, NYTA, CFI staff, those people, they are not philosophical most of the time. Mm-hmm. You find you're dealing with the people who are just, some of them graduates from certain colleges or tertiary institutions, but they never ran businesses before. Let's make an example about soccer. You can never be a best coach, mostly if you haven't played soccer before. So you will go there, apply for funding, knowing exactly that what does your business need in most of the time. But you're going to get a response, a blanket response that they're not going to help you because of you don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But they are not really diagnosing what does your business need. Personally so, but because of they follow the instruction from the book that you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to be supported for, then if you don't have 5, you're not going to get it, regardless of what is your position and then what have you managed to do up until a certain period of time, the type of a thing. Yeah. And most of the time, they don't even talk. You go to NYTA is going to refer you to CIFA. Why do I have to do so? Because of you are NYTA corresponded me to CIFA directly. Not to say me, I work there by myself. You need to refer me to those people, hold my hands to go to those people that Refilo doesn't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Let me say this to you very quickly about that, Refilo. We're going to be getting some of those agencies to be part of this conversation as we move along, right? So that we can also expose them to some of the difficulties that you, as somebody who seeks funding, are experiencing. I think that conversation needs to start happening. But let me hear what Andisa has to say with regards to your call and the issues you raise.
Aubrey, I see we keep on getting dragged to how do we get our government?
Yeah, sure.
And by the way, not to say that I disagree with it. I actually fully agree with the last caller. I fully agree with Vusi as well. Remember, what you and I are trying to do is get our entrepreneurs at least to think about this value concept,
sure,
and how to fund it. There's equally a very important debate to be had on the government side, and how it plays a role in supporting the development of small business. We spoke about the policy framework that could accrue, and some of the incentives that are there. In fact, I'll even argue that there's actually quite a number of incentives in various areas in industries. I mean, in agro-processing, even in the call center, by the way, the outsourcing space, that the incentives, but they are very, very complicated to access. In fact, more often than not, you probably need consultants who understand that complicated space. But I think there is an opportunity to streamline those incentives. And to Vusi's point, by the way, there's a greater policy debate to be had. And I've sort of like been shying away, because this is a very highly political debate.
It's a very politicized
I would say fundamentally it's and maybe this is the only critique I'll ever do on this show again. It's the lack of leadership. The exercise of that leadership. With that, what vision do we have for entrepreneurship in the country? What role do we think the state must play, both on a policy point of view as well as using the lever, which is the state spend, by the way, to make sure that we harness and grow entrepreneurship. But I want to stay away from those, because I think our role, and not to say that we shouldn't have that debate, and I'll welcome to be part and parcel of that platform. But here we're trying to sharpen the mind of the entrepreneur, is to say, with the limited resources that are there, what do you access for what purpose, and what's the best way of trying to get that little dividend that's as ineffective as it is.
I think this platform is going to play that role for us to start getting closer to government and have these conversations at a policy level. That I think we need to play that role to make that space, or to shorten that gap. I think we do need to start.
No, we can influence it and shape it as well. Absolutely. Because I mean, we have vivid point around. If, for example, industrialization is still, for me, without quoting some politics, because I know in Parliament, industrialization was mentioned by one, which, by the way, I fully subscribe to that. But industrialization as a concept is just that, a concept. You need a whole lever of the state and the willingness and the like-minded of leadership and vision to make it take shape.
I want to take a very quick call from Alfred in Everton. Alfred, thanks very much for holding, my brother. If you can give me your question in 30 seconds, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. O'Brien, I guess there.
Thank you, sir.
What I try to highlight about something, I'm having a problem. I was having a problem. I will mention that about the issue about the funding and so on. I went through that process that they just mentioned it. Most of the things, especially the banks. When you came along with especially a startup, you came with the contract. Can you please fund me because I'm your client and so on? They look at the 3-year statement and said, we are having a problem.
Sure.
Our transaction for you doesn't show you are consistent with us. So we won't be able. I came from that scenario.
Sure.
We won't be able to help you. So I was having a problem. I was supposed to lend some money from my friend, so that I can fund this project of mine, which means the government doesn't oversee. Did these people, when they do the INDAB and so on, they did exactly what they supposed to do.
Alfred, my brother, I want to stop you there because it's part of the conversation we're going to have next time. Yeah, I hear Alfred. But I think it's really indicative of why this conversation needs to deepen while it simplifies, right? So it needs to get deeper, but it needs to be a lot more accessible. Because I think that there are levers here that we first need to understand. We need to understand the language. We need to understand the accessibility of some of the institutions that are out there. And then I suppose we also need to talk about policy. So there's a lot of things to talk about this as we close, Andisa.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Aubrey. It's an ecosystem.
Yep.
There's a number of role players, and everyone has got quite an essential role to play. Ours, to date, we have limited that to building the skills and I guess the resilient entrepreneur, and it all starts with strategy and value creation. And how do you create creating businesses that are fundable? Because there's also, I mean, the stick is long if you think about it. At the other end of the stick is entrepreneurs that are not being able to be funded. At the other end, there are financiers who are saying, but we're not finding enough bankable business that we are able to fund. And our role is to bridge that gap so that if there's politics to be discussed, we deal with the politics.
How do we find
and less. So you can find me at info@ntiyisoconsulting.co.za.
Group Chief Advisor at Ntiyiso Consulting Group, Andisa Ramavhunga. Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. It's 2